Okay. Ready to get started? All right, I want to do a little bit of a recap of the last two Sundays just to give you a little bit of, in case you didn't hear one or both or forgot them. I want to just give a quick, 5 minutes. So from Hebrews 12, verses 1 and 2, we started talking about what faith actually is. We know that Hebrews 11 talks about faith is the evidence of things hoped for, the substance of things not seen, or vice versa, actually. But in verse 2 of Hebrews 12, it says, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and the perfecter of faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of God the Father. Some real keys out of that verse is that it's first, to fix our eyes on Jesus means to consider attentively. And then it calls Jesus the author, which is the original and chief leader. So when you think of the author, think of the original leader, the highest, the original, the first leader. And he is the one who wrote and designed the deepest parts of who we are. He's the one who formed us in our mother's womb. He is the originator of who we are. So it would make sense to consider attentively our eyes on Jesus. So he's the author, which means he's the beginning, and he's the perfecter, which means he's the completer and the consummator of faith. Okay. He's the perfecter and the author of faith. And we've defined faith as conviction, moral credence, and at its most core definition, faith is what we have settled on inside of us due to consistent persuasion and argument. So faith is this deep, abiding confidence in what is what actually is. Okay? I started to go on and I kind of expanded on those definitions a little bit, and I talked about faith is like what has had the deepest impact on you experientially, or what you have sown into and harvested from on a consistent basis in your life. Faith is also, and I think this is probably the biggest one for most of us. Don't get me wrong, I think many of us have a faith based upon a deep and abiding experience with something or someone. But I think for most of us, our faith is built on what is on constant repeat in our inner dialogue. What are you thinking about the most? What are you pondering? What is going over and over in your mind? What are thought processes, belief systems, not even systems, but belief statements, things you believe about people, about yourself, about God, about the world. Leslie Gaber a couple years ago did a teaching on victim mentality here. And for many people, we don't realize this. It's not just a mentality. That's actually our faith. So when you feel like a victim, you automatically assume that the whole world is against you. When you feel like a victim, you don't think anything's ever going to work out for you. When you feel like a victim, you always feel like you're under and everybody else is over. You always feel like you're going to just have to deal with whatever happens in life. And that's actually more than a mentality. That's actually a faith system. That's the bedrock of who we are. And from that place, the reason why Hebrews 12, 1 and 2 is so important, is from this place called our faith is really what determines how we view the world and eventually how the whole world interacts with us. Our faith determines how we interact with the world and how the world interacts with us and its impact on us. Our faith determines that, because our faith, at the core level, is what we believe the most. What has had the deepest impact on us, or what we're most convinced of. And I've kind of been hammering this definition home because for too long, we've simply just said as Christians that our faith is in Jesus, or our faith is the person of Jesus. And it makes sense to say that as a Christian, but I wonder how often that actually plays out in our reality. It's the reason why I talk about this and kind of hammer this, because I think we need to get real rock bottom serious with the Lord and ask him, is my faith really in you? Is my greatest, deepest impacting experience with Jesus? Or is my most thought about, my most constantly considered argument? An argument is not necessarily like a fight. If you actually look up the difference of argument or the definition of argument, it actually just means a way of thinking that confronts other ways of thinking. Okay, that's really what an argument is. An argument is the way you think. And at the deepest core of who you are is the way you think aligned with or actually who the truth is, which is Jesus. Okay? That is a really important bedrock foundational understanding of faith that's important for us to go forward. So that was kind of like 2 Sundays ago. That was the summary of that. And then this past Sunday, I talked about how to alter or how to shift or how to reestablish faith. I talked about Proverbs, how Proverbs 1 talks about wisdom by nature is foundational. The Bible talks about in Proverbs 1 verse 7 that we should start with God, that all learning starts with God. That's Proverbs chapter 1 verse 7. I talked about how you can react to reactions or respond to real need. And whether or not you react to someone's reactions or you actually respond to what's happening underneath, what's happening at core places, that is actually a revelation of our faith. So, back to how I said, faith determines how I interact with the world and how the world interacts with me. If I have a faith in the person who is Jesus, you can come at me with any kind of anger, any kind of depression, any kind of accusation, any kind of whatever attitude, feeling, whatever. And because my bedrock faith, what I'm most convinced of, is who the person of Jesus is, I might interact with you at that level, but I'm actually responding to you at a deeper place. So what we do too often is when our faith isn't in the person of Jesus and it's in maybe our relationship. Like, so for some people, one of our deep abiding parts of our faith is I want people to be happy with me, or I want peace in my relationships and all that. And so we'll just do whatever it takes to have peace. That's a revelation of our faith. And we never actually get to core issues. We always kind of deal with things on these outer levels. And that's what I was talking about on Sunday this past, how so many of the issues that are in the world will continue as long as we wage war and kind of battle with arguments out here on the surface instead of getting down to root issues. Wisdom, true godly wisdom, does not deal with issues at face value. Never. That's why Jesus was so confounding to so many people when he walked the earth, because it felt like he was never dealing with the issue at hand. Whenever he got asked a question, whenever someone confronted him about something, he would always answer with like a parable, or he would answer with a much deeper, and so most of the people probably walked away thinking, what in the world is this guy talking about? That had nothing to do with this scenario. But as they went home, deep within them, they started thinking, oh my gosh, I'm feeling something much deeper on the inside of me. I had this question or I had this concern, but as Jesus was interacting with me, something deeper started to awaken. That's what real faith in the person of Jesus does. But faith in anything else has a tendency to pull us up into like fleshly arguments. I was talking about, and then I used the example even of like socialism versus capitalism. And I really don't want to get into that specificity tonight. We can talk about that more if you have a question about it. But I really want to get to education tonight. And so, finally, the last thing I really wanted to get to about this faith in Jesus versus faith in anything else is if our faith is in Jesus, the eyes of our hearts respond to the real needs and concerns of people. Okay? Faith in Jesus doesn't necessarily just hear what someone is actually saying and thinking that's the issue. The beautiful thing about when your rock is the person of Jesus, you have a tendency to go right to the core of people. You don't even realize you're doing it. You're just, like you're hearing someone say something, but you're actually hearing the cry of their heart. And instead of responding to what they say, the faith who is in Jesus, our faith who is in Jesus, responds to this deeper cry on the inside of them. And when we respond often to the deeper cry, at first people get even angrier. I've had it happen to me. You've probably had it happen to you. They're like, you're not dealing with what I'm actually saying. You're not actually listening to me. But over time, if we continue to respond to people from a deeper, more rock-solid faith, real things begin to get attended to. I think we really begin to solve the biggest problems that are on the planet. But what I get really concerned about as a person that still walks the earth today is that we go tit for tat too many times. We fight other people's reactions to real problems instead of actually addressing real problems. And so I'll just talk about the socialism thing just for a second. My biggest concern is that we Christians have the real answers to people's problems. Like Jesus in us can interact with people at the deepest places of who they are and actually bring empowerment, freedom, healing, and restoration to people's lives. But if what we are doing as Christians and focusing all of our attention on why the world's way of answering those problems is wrong, then we expend all of our energy fighting and arguing and trying to convince someone that why that isn't right, instead of actually using the energy and the power of God in us to actually bring real restoration to people's lives. And that's why I kind of summed it up by saying this. Light just shines. Light doesn't try to convince the darkness why it shouldn't be dark. Darkness only knows how to be dark. Instead, light just does what it was created to do. You are a child of God, created to shine, created to be made, not just made in the image of God, but created to literally be, speak, love, and interact in the nature and image of God. And when you do that, you don't even need to fight what's wrong. You don't need to address what's evil. You simply be good. You simply be righteousness. You be holy. And people get healed. People get restored. At the root of every problem that walks the planet right now is a broken heart, is an unhealed person. And I believe that responding from this deep rock of our salvation type faith begins to really address big issues. So, when our faith is in Jesus, the eyes of our heart respond to the real needs and concerns of people. If our faith is rooted in fear, and fear, I'm going to tell you, I think you have two ways of looking at the world, with faith or with fear. And if we respond to the world with fear, if our faith is rooted in fear, and I'm going to explain that a little bit more, we'll react to the world's responses and war out on those edges, like I said. Turn with me to Ephesians chapter 1. And I'm going to refer to Genesis chapters 1 and 3, but I want to read actually Ephesians chapter 1. We've talked about this, what I'm about to do before, but it's a good foundation for what I want to do tonight. There's several different starting points of Christianity. And I say that might sound like a strange statement to say, but the way Christianity is presented in the world is different. Not everybody presents the gospel the same way. I would say the most foundational one of recent memory, I would say the most fundamental, not foundational, but the most fundamental one is that you're a sinner. And there's nothing you can do about your sin, Jeff. And so Jesus comes to do what you cannot do on your own. And then we talk about this, what salvation is. Salvation is if you don't repent of your sins, you'll go to hell. But if you believe in Jesus and repent of your sin, then you'll go to heaven. I would say that that's the majority of the gospel that was presented to every one of us in this room. Something along those lines, right? Okay. I propose to you that that's not the gospel. And we've talked about this before, but I want to just reiterate this. That is a gospel based in fear. The fear is Jeff may go to hell. Jeff may live forever in his sins. Okay? Now, don't get me wrong. That's a loving, compassionate desire to see you not suffer in your sins any longer and to not go to hell. So I'm not saying it's not loving and it's not compassionate, but it's rooted in something that we don't want to have happen to Jeff. There is a better gospel. And the gospel actually starts previous to even the earth beginning. And that's why I had you turn to Ephesians 1. We use this section of Scripture in SOS. Every time we have an SOS. Because this is the real beginning of the gospel. Blessed be the God, verse 3, and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who has blessed us with every spiritual blessing in the heavenly places in Christ. Verse 4 is the key. This is the beginning of the gospel of Christianity, of Jesus. Just as he, God the Father, chose us in him, Jesus, before the foundation of the world, that we would be holy and blameless before him. In love, he predestined us. All of this is happening before even the world is created in Genesis 1. In love, he predestines us to adoption as sons through Jesus Christ to himself, according to the kind intention of will, to the praise of the glory of his grace, which he freely bestowed upon us in the beloved. You hear that? Now for me, that is a much better beginning and a much better introduction for me. Like, I wish someone would have told me about this. Don't get me wrong, I still got saved. And I got to this revelation of a good, loving Father. But the real gospel is that every human being has a loving Father who chose them before they were ever created. Before they ever were formed in their mother's womb, before they ever breathed a breath, you have a Father who loves you. So no matter what you're experiencing on the planet Earth, no matter what your life has experienced, no matter what you have gone through, there is a Father who loves you. And when you turn your heart and reestablish relationship with this Father, because sin broke that relationship, there you come into Genesis 3. Don't get me wrong, Genesis 3 is still part of the gospel, but it's not the beginning of the gospel. The beginning of the gospel is not hopelessness. The beginning of the gospel isn't you're a dirty, awful sinner. The beginning of the gospel is you were fearfully and wonderfully thought about and then created by a loving Father. Do you hear the difference in those two gospels? If the world was being preached that gospel, which I'm actually hearing more and more, by the way, we're actually beginning to hear that as the gospel more and more than these, turn or burn type revivals, things and things like that. Like, we're hearing more and more about that people have a loving Father and they need to experience this love. Okay, so why am I talking about this and what does this have to do with anything? Genesis 3 Christianity is rooted in fear. It's a reaction to fear. I don't want Lauren to go to hell. She's my child, and the last thing I would ever want is for her to experience hell, so I got to make sure she gets saved. What that is, it's a reaction to fear. What's the fear? The fear is she's going to go to hell, and I don't want her to go to hell. And then think about this, I base her experience with Christianity. What's base mean? When you say I base, you say what? Foundation. I start my daughter's foundation. The foundation of her relationship with God is fear. And until that experience, and for many Christians, that actual introduction to Christianity needs healed before they can actually experience God as a loving Father. And I've watched it so many times. We've done about 30 or 40 SOSs now, and I've watched time after time people experience that healing and that restoration when they get to see and experience God as a loving Father. It changes everything. I think I told you guys this one time. One of the young guys, he was about 20 years old. He said, honestly, I've hated going to church. My parents made me go to church because the gospel I was introduced to convinced me that I was going to spend eternity in heaven with a God that hated me. And the only reason why he was able to stand me was because some guy shed his blood and covered me. Now you think about that from a 20-year-old perspective, and he grew up with that mentality, and it wasn't until SOS that he actually got to see and experience God as a loving Father. His basis was fear, which means he was going to spend all eternity in fear, afraid of a God who didn't like him. Now that might sound like an extreme story to you, but many of us don't visit our base enough. We don't visit our foundations enough. How many people go down to the recesses of their basement very often? I mean, you probably do. I don't know. Yeah. What brought him to SOS? His girlfriend. Yeah. I mean, basically, he came to SOS the way he was dragged to church every Sunday. But he had a experience that went, and that's back to this faith thing. He had an experience with a loving Father that went deeper than the fear he was introduced to. When you encourage someone to experience God as he is, you give them the opportunity to reestablish faith. That's the beauty of this gospel, this better gospel. Okay, so the reason why I said about this basement thing is that oftentimes we don't revisit our foundation. And so thinking along the lines of, well, how was I introduced to Jesus? It's not that big of a deal. We just built on top of that and everything's going to be fine. That's not true. Because when the worst of times come in your life, it's what's at the core of who you are that determines how well you'll be able to handle that. So, the examples here, Christianity, based on Genesis chapter 3, actually starts with an enemy. If you think about Genesis chapter 3, the star of that story is a serpent who tricks, deceives, lies to Eve and convinces her that it's okay to eat of the tree. As a result, Adam eats. As a result, there's a fall. And then he goes into the rest of Genesis 3 where it talks about, okay, as a result of the fall, these things are going to happen. And I bet you most of us can remember a lot of the things that were the penalties or the results of sin or the fall of Adam and Eve. How many people can remember at least one? Go ahead, name one, Orpha. Painful childbirth. Every woman remembers that one, right? Somebody else. Toiling in the earth, right. Well, there's one that I always like to talk about. A woman shall desire her husband. You guys know this, right? Like, she'll always be desiring her husband, but actually the original language actually says, but he'll be focused on toiling. He'll have to be working a lot harder in the ground now because the ground used to just produce because he walked by, and now he's got to work it, and she's going to be yearning for him, and he's going to be focused on his work. Okay, so I know that has nothing to do with really what I talk about today, but let me ask you this. How many people knew what Ephesians 1, 4, and 5 said before I read it? One person? We've read it many times, but yeah. Huh? You took SOS. Here's the point. Most of us, because our foundation is Genesis 3 and not before the foundation of the world, most of us can remember the penalties of the fall. In fact, if I were to ask you right now, how would you present the gospel if I had not told you what I just told you? Many of you would have had to at least fight with the recording. Am I right? Come on. Yeah, at some point in time you would have brought up sin. At some point in time you would have brought up maybe hell even. And that's that recording. And whether you want to admit it or not, and when you get down to those basement levels of who you are, you begin to find out, wow, some of these things are at the root of my faith. And that faith is based in fear. You can have faith based in fear. You can have a faith, an absolute convinced state that things are going to go bad. And then you will build an entire life that tries to make sure that bad things don't happen. And there's many people who do that. That's why my last couple lessons where I talked about money, many people who save money don't save for opportunities. They save in case something bad happens. Or they save in such a way that nobody else can get it because someone else might take it. I can't invest it. I might lose it. All of that is fear. And whether we realize it or not, there's an absolute probability that many of our lives have some level of basis in fear. I think it's the reason why Jesus said it was for freedom that Christ has set us free. It's the reason why the opposite of fear is perfect love. Now, if you look at the Ephesians 1 and thinking about before the foundations of the world, if that's the kind of Christianity you ponder, if the God that you think about and the person you think about, let's just think about this for a second. If you have a Genesis 3 Christian faith, then you do not think of yourself as often as you should as a beloved child of a loving Father. You often think of yourself negatively. You often think of yourself as what you do wrong. I promise you, that's part of the root of this faith. Or not the root, but part of the springing up. One of the branches of this faith is you see yourself as broken. You see yourself as less than. You see yourself as under. You see yourself as, oh, I screwed that up. When you lay down in bed, you think about what you did wrong, or what you could have said differently, or why this didn't work, or what, instead of thinking about, I am incredible. Like, how many people actually think about that on a daily basis? Come on. Let's be honest. Huh? Right. See, again, fear. I'm telling you, that thing is based in fear. You're afraid that you're going to be vain. And then I'm going to be selfish. I'm going to be self-centered. Yeah, but the reality is, children think they're awesome. How many teachers can say amen to that, or parents? Like, you actually think you're better than you really are? Some of us have to humble our kids. And it's almost like Jesus says, whoa, 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 hold off on that. They're going to need all of that they can get. Remember how you feel right now. Might be good to not maybe, might be good to encourage some of that. Now, I know there's some over-the-top stuff. Don't get me wrong. But here's the point. The point, if we're rooted in Ephesians 1, faith, then you have this view of yourself that you're beloved, that you have value, that you matter, that people actually want you in their lives. Unless that's your root, you don't think that way on a daily basis. And as a result, you probably live smaller than you should. You probably don't take many risks. You probably don't take big steps of faith. You probably just try to figure out how to get through the day. But people that have a rock-solid faith in the King of Kings realize that they're attached to something way bigger than anything fear could try to swallow. In fact, fear can't swallow this faith. You starting to feel that a little bit? Like, there's a difference in this, okay? And so I bring up those two examples because I will tell you that, I wanted to say some, but I have a feeling it's probably the majority of churches across the globe are probably more founded on a Genesis 3 view of God than a Genesis 1 or even before Genesis 1, Ephesians 1 view of God. And as a result of an Ephesians 1 perspective, so who's the star of the Ephesians 1 perspective? Do I need to read that again? The star of the Genesis 3 perspective is the enemy, the serpent. Who's the star of Genesis 1 or Ephesians 1 before Genesis 1? We are, and God is. Like, there is no enemy. There is no serpent. There is just loving Father, beloved child. That's the beginning. And there's so much hope in that beginning. And if you actually look at the real word for salvation, it's the Greek word sozo, which means to heal, restore, and make whole. Which means the real story is not to restore you to Genesis 3, it's to restore you to Ephesians 1. It's to restore you back to something incredible. And when you realize salvation's not to get you out of something, but to get you into something that you were always meant to be, now there's incredible hope. You live bigger, you live brighter, you live with more hope, with greater vision when you live from this perspective. What I love about that is it starts with the enemy in Genesis 3, and it starts with God and us in Ephesians 1. And there we go back to Proverbs 1:7, where it says, the beginning of knowledge, or the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. That's the King James-ish version. The Message version, which I love of Proverbs 1:7, is start with God. Bowing down to God is the beginning of all learning. For me, that is like, when I think about education, teaching people or children or whatever, when I think about it from the heavenly perspective, that's what I hear. Until the foundation, until the very rock, the faith, the most convincing argument of the system in which, the classroom, the home in which we teach, the car in which we're about to unload something to our children, if the foundation of that is God, then whatever we're going to build on, that's going to stay. And it's going to be fruitful, and it's going to multiply. So, And I need to emphasize this because I think that fear and faith, or love, response to faith, are the two competing commitments inside of education. I think the examples that we have in Genesis 3 and Ephesians 1 are very similar to the choices we have in education. And so the more we trend to an extreme of any spectrum, so now I'm going to start getting a little more practical, a little more into the reality of current, present day. So we have spectrum and everything. Like everyone's got a view of something. Politics is the easiest thing to look at as far as a spectrum goes. But in any spectrum, but politics is the easy one, so I'll just use that as an example. So you have a spectrum. Here's the middle of the spectrum. Far, that'd be your left. So the far left on the political spectrum is what? Liberal, Democrat. And this is your far right. So the far right is Republican or conservative. Okay? So the more you trend to one side of any spectrum, I don't care what side. Name. We can call it this way, call it a pole, a north or a south pole. I've talked about this in marriages and in relationships. Whenever we trend more and more to the extremes of any spectrum, the more fear factors in. I'll explain this simply. The more I trend over here as a conservative, politically core person, I'm more and more afraid of that other end. And the more afraid I am of that other end, the more I trend this way. And then when I look over there, I usually look at the spectrum based upon where I am on the opposite side. So I rarely look at the middle and determine how they are. If I'm on the far right, I'm usually looking at the far left. It's the way it works. Any situation you're in. So let's go back, let's do something a little more simple, like a relationship. So in my relationship, as we're working through something with somebody else, and I'm here in the spectrum instead of way out here, I'm not seeing them as an extreme. I usually see that person closer to where I am, but maybe on the other side. I hope you're hearing that. We tend to see the world based upon where we are. It's how we do this. And the more we trend to the extremes, the more fear factors in. Now, as it relates to education, I think it's the same thing. We have a choice between founding, literally basing our educational perspective either in fear or in true faith. If we are based in fear, this is what happens. We move from educate, we actually educate from something. So instead of educating towards something, which I think is what Ephesians 1 is. Ephesians 1 type teaching, starting with God type teaching, is we have a direction, we have a focus, we have a hope, we have a vision, we have a future with a hope, and so we're going toward that thing. When we educate that way, we're educating in empowerment. We're seeing what's possible. When we move from educating to something, let me just say this sentence and then I'll go back and explain it. When we move from educating to something to educating from something, I'm trying to get my thoughts out to you so you can understand it. These are two perspectives of how we teach. I do this in my life. I've been taught this way by people, and I had to repent of it, both when it was taught to me and when I taught to other people. I could feel the fear when someone was trying to get me to understand something. And oftentimes, the basis of the teaching was you don't want to go there. So they were teaching me they were trying to protect me from something. They were trying to make sure I didn't get over here. It wasn't about hope and opportunity. It was about making sure I don't fall off this cliff over here. The goal of true education is empowerment, which leads to freedom. And inherent in freedom is trust. The problem is, there's also another way of teaching, and it's so easy to fall into this trap because the world is fraught with problems, fraught with all kinds of situations that are very scary to parents, teachers, and as a result, they don't want their children to get in trouble, They don't want their children to fall into problems, and so we have a tendency to educate from things. This is protection. It sounds good to protect your children, but over time, if we teach to protect our kids, it leads to slavery. If you're always teaching to protect, just think about it. If you actually look at the real definition of protect, it means to hedge all about. It means to build walls and to build bulwarks so that nothing can get you. That's actually what the term means, to protect. To empower means you are given everything you need, and you're also, things inside of you are being called up, and there's empowerment for every opportunity that's available. Empowerment leads to freedom. Protection leads to slavery. And you can look at Romans 8 and you can see all of those. I'm not going to go there tonight because I'm already at 7:41. Okay. Empowerment leads to freedom, and protection leads to slavery. If we teach to something, not away from something, and I don't know how else to say this. Like, I'm trying to think of another way to do this. I'm thinking like a teacher right now. Well, maybe if I just keep talking through these notes, maybe it'll... Yeah. So, empowerment, if we lead to empower, or if we teach to empower, we create freedom in our students. But if we teach to protect our students, it actually leads to slavery. We actually weaken people by teaching to protect them. I think it's like in church, like the difference between a sin-conscious mentality and a God-conscious mentality. I think there's a lot of churches who teach 10 steps to not sin, or the 3 steps to not be stressed, or all of this, and when in reality, the whole point of the church is to give people an experience with God. And when you have an experience with God, you realize there's an abundant, incredible life where everything is possible. Huge difference between those two. Inherent in empowerment is trust. So the beautiful thing about teaching to empower is that at the end of it, you get to trust the people you've just taught. That's incredible. You actually get to free people. And when people feel trusted, they feel empowered. That's the whole point. And so empowerment leads to trust. I trust you because I've taught you in such a way that you have the tools you need to go out into the world. And what that says to the student, what that says to the one who's being educated is, I am trusted. That is huge. If we teach from something based in fear, then we have to protect them. That leads to slavery. And let me show you what slavery is. Slavery is I always have to have somebody else telling me what to do. I cannot be trusted to know what to do on my own. So I always have to have somebody else tell me. And I will tell you, I'm concerned that a lot of, not all of, but a lot of the educational system is training people to be employees, to be under, to be told what to do, not be empowered to lead, not be empowered to create, not be empowered to take opportunities and to build and to grow things. Most people are being taught what they need to know so they can continue to be told what to do. And that's because fear is at the base of the educational system in that way. This, I'm going to tell you, and this is going to sound like a hard word, but I'm going to say it because I think the result of teaching from a foundation of fear is indoctrination. Indoctrination is the best way to help people you don't trust. I'm going to let that settle in. The best thing to do, because you're not always going to be around your kids, whether you're a teacher or a parent. At some point in time, those kids are going to go. So the only thing if you're fearful about what the world's going to do to them or what they're going to do out there in the world, oh my gosh, they're going to screw up, or oh my gosh, the world's going to kill them, or whatever it is, you're going to indoctrinate them because you're not always going to be around them. What is indoctrination? Indoctrination is an inner slave master. It's an inner slave master meant to tell us what to do when the one who taught it isn't present. Indoctrination, brainwashing. Guys, I'm being honest. I know these are hard words, but I think too much of our educational system is based on indoctrination and brainwashing. Just do what we tell you to do and keep repeating that over and over again. We are telling people, instead of how to think, we're telling people what to think. That is not education. Education is not telling people what to think. We're supposed to be showing people how. That they have the capability to solve problems. They have the capability to connect things together that were never connected before. Indoctrination is a system of thought meant to run on repeat within the child so it becomes their faith. Hello? I'm going to say it again. A system of thought. Indoctrination is a system of thought meant to run on repeat within the child so it becomes their faith. What I have just said here about empowerment versus protection, freedom into trust versus indoctrination, I think is the competition that's existing right now in our educational system. I think the Spirit of the Lord wants to empower people. I think it exists on the planet to show us how incredible we are, how much potential's on the inside of us, what's possible, what's available, what's like above all you could think, ask, or imagine. That's what's possible on the inside of every one of these children. That's what the Spirit of the Lord is doing. What I'm concerned about is that the educational system is instead trying to make sure that children know this, and then know this, and then know this. And it sounds like we're preparing them for the world, but what we're actually doing is trying to make them what we think they should be. That's indoctrination. See, there's a verse in the Bible, and this is all Proverbs say. I'm just giving you all Proverbs. Proverbs 22:6. Some of you can probably just read this to me verbatim. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Powerful verse, okay? And I know it's an overused one, and I know you can, Mark, that was such low-hanging fruit for education, but there is so much in there. The Message version of this, again, love the Message, Proverbs 22:6. Point your kids in the right direction, and when they're old, they won't be lost. Like, for me, that sounds so much more like education than you sit down here for 8 hours a day. How many days a year? 180? 180 days a year, and we're going to tell you what to think. The root of education, the spirit of education, is kids. Go for it. Like the spirit of the classroom, the spirit of the home as children are being raised up in it should be, hey kids, look over here, the light. Now, this is going to start sounding pretty Christian, but I am telling you that heaven really thinks Jesus is important. I just need to say that out loud. If what I'm doing here this year is giving the heavenly perspective on earth's issues, then I'm going to have to bring up the way heaven sees education. And the way heaven sees education is Jesus is at the center of it. And this is really hard because in the public education system, teachers like Melanie can't even use the name. But I am telling you, he is at the core of true, pure education. But there's still a way you can bring him in. There's still a way. So Proverbs 22:6, train up a child in the way he should go. Even when he is old, he will not depart from it. And I love this. Point your kids in the right direction. When they're old, they won't be lost. I like this also. The original language of that second phrase, or not the second phrase, but train up a child in the way he should go, actually means according to his way. Which means there is a specific way in which our children learn. And the beautiful thing is that if we are given any level of responsibility to influence a child's life, it's not good enough to just tell them what we know. In fact, I will tell you, that's not even education. True education is learning the child. And that takes time. Now, when you're a parent of only 3 or 4, you can probably do it. But when you're a teacher of how many is in your classroom? 22. Woo! You need to ask the Lord for an anointing to learn how each one of those kids learns. But if you really want a child to be trained up in the way that they should go, you actually have to learn the child. So a pure educational system is an exchange of understanding. It's not just one way where the teacher teaches the kids. There's actually the kids teaching the teacher, this is who I am. And the teacher should be one of the greatest students in the room all the time. The parent should be one of the greatest students in the room all the time. So Lauren, you're bringing Tiago into the world right now. You should be just looking at him all the time, learning him. Probably you already are. You probably know every little freckle, every little crease, all that kind of stuff. Keep doing that. Learn their mannerisms. Learn the way that they pick things up, the way they start to process information. For every child, it's just a little bit different. And the more we learn how they learn, the more we can quickly empower them for life. That's what this is. The two keys out of this Proverbs 22:6. Number one, education is forward. Education is never, don't do this. Education is never, make sure you don't fall into this trap. Education is always, look what's possible. Train up a child in the way he should go. Proverbs 22:6 in the Message. Point your kids in the right direction. Everything about education from the biblical perspective is forward. Jesus, for the joy set before him. Everything is forward. So in education, you're always thinking about what is possible, what the children are going to potentially be involved in the future, and then you teach backwards from that into their reality right now. And then secondly, like I just said, education is intended to be according to the way of the child, their nature, their aptitude, their mannerisms, the way they learn. Indoctrination does never consider the way of the child. Indoctrination is bent on a specific code overriding whatever's on the inside of them. I want to tell you, going all the way back to the Genesis 3 type of Christianity, a teacher that's based in fear, that is more trained to indoctrinate than to empower, will look at a child and immediately assume they don't know anything. And they need to know what I need to know, and if they don't get what I have in for them, then they're going to be a screw-up. Now, I know probably many teachers would never think those exact words to themselves, but an indoctrinating type of mentality thinks that that child inherently is either bad, stupid, or flat out wrong. And so indoctrination comes in and says, I need to correct you. And so that's something else I didn't even want to talk about tonight, but it's part and parcel of education, is how we correct students when they misbehave. Like there's two ways of like rules versus standards. For those of you that took SOS, know a little bit about those. Rules are always trying to protect you from doing bad things, and if you do a bad thing, then you get punished, and then there's fear. The whole reason why you don't do a bad thing is you don't want to get punished. There's Genesis 3, Christianity. Or correction sounds like this. Hey. I know who you really are. Who you really are is this, and this. Does that line up with how you're acting right now? Do you hear the difference? There's a beautiful difference there. And if you constantly compare their current behavior model to their true identity as a beloved child of God, and again, you don't have to use the names, because in public education you can't, but you can still say, you're an incredible person. You are kind. What's the help thing where she always says to him, or she says to the girl, you is kind, you is smart, you is important. Like, you just think about that. If that was the spirit of the classroom and someone misbehaved and the whole group said, oh, everybody stop, turn, and tell Susie, she is kind, she is those. I told you the story of that African tribe that does that every time there's an African tribe. Missionaries found this tribe and they couldn't believe what happened in this tribe. There was no crime in this tribe. And what happened was, at a very young age, there is a big, long story to this, but I'll try to give it really quick. A mom, as she's pregnant with the child, is told to pay attention to her dreams while she's having the child. Because oftentimes during the 9 months of pregnancy, she'll have dreams that speak to who the child's going to be. And then what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to tell the village, these are the dreams I'm having while I'm pregnant with this child. So you're preparing, oh my gosh, I can feel the Lord in this. You're preparing the entire village to know this child before the child's ever here. And so when the child shows up, by the time the child's on the scene, Tiago's age, the whole community already knows this child, already knows what God, from their perspective, was planning, thinking. And all this time, they're beginning to create in their imaginations this beautiful value, all of these things that this person will eventually contribute to the tribe. And then this child starts to grow. And this is the most beautiful part of this story. When this child grows, and let's say this child does something that's considered outside of the normal standards of the tribe, what they'll do is they'll surround that person, whether at a young age or even as an adult. Every once in a while, they do something wrong. They surround the child, and then they run outside the camp. So I can't even picture this, but supposedly they just start running, and everybody has to run, and they stay in the group with the person that committed the infraction in the middle, and they're all running outside the camp like this. And when they get outside the camp, all they do is they start saying everything mom was dreaming about when that child was in the womb. They tell this person the stories, and they remind them of their value. And it says that every single time that person just breaks and starts weeping and repents to the whole village, and then they all go have a celebration. They go back home to the village and celebrate. That's powerful. That's correction. That's divine. Without ever the gospel being presented to a tribe, there's the beauty of I think, the father with his kids. I feel like somewhere in that story is the true spirit of correction in a classroom or in a family. Okay, so anyway, from Proverbs 22:6, the two keys are education is forward, not, oh gosh, you don't want to do that. No, you're educating toward, look what's possible. You could be in space someday. That kind of thing. Now here's where I wanted to go tonight with us as parents and as teachers. An educator, and an educator is not necessarily someone who's just a teacher. I know we have a couple of teachers in the room, but all of us at some level are educators. All of us at some level are helping someone else gain understanding, be empowered at what they're doing. An educator's faith will always determine what and how a child is taught. So just follow this reasoning with me. Back to the beginning, 2 Sundays ago, where I talked about faith. Faith is what has us, okay? It's that deepest experience I've ever had, or it's this ongoing narrative that now I don't even have to conjure it up. When someone says something, it's almost on repeat. I'm able to just say it almost without even thinking. That's my faith. What event or experience has had the deepest impact? The inner dialogue that's going on. Okay, so if that's what faith is, then faith by nature becomes our story. If it's the deepest thing that's ever happened to you, it's the deepest experience, or if it's the ongoing narrative happening on the inside of you, whether you like it or not, that becomes the story of your life. It wouldn't matter if you were reading the Declaration of Independence to people, they would still get your faith because there's spirit involved with this. Faith is spirit, and it gets transferred. So faith by nature is what becomes our story, what consistently comes out of us, the theme of our thought and emotional life. That is what will eventually be communicated out of our life. And oftentimes it does come out of our mouth, but even if it doesn't come out of our mouth, has anybody ever, look, I know what I really want to say, but I'm going to say this because it's the right thing to say. But underneath, you're actually thinking and feeling something else. Has that ever happened to you? It's happened to me. What's actually happening underneath, what you actually want to say, that's your faith. That's actually what you're convinced of. So if faith is what has us, and then faith by nature is what actually is, and it becomes our story, then our story, what our life communicates, becomes our curriculum. And our curriculum, we're designed by the Lord to communicate what we are most impacted by or what we're most convinced of. You're designed by God that way. It doesn't matter if you know something else is right or true. What you have been convinced of internally is what you will teach other people. This is really important. Because you can say right information to somebody, but you will eventually communicate your faith. What we are convinced of is what we will always, and I say always with intention, what we are convinced of, we will always try to convince others of. So important. So let's go back to that story I said 2 Sundays ago about rejection. If I have been rejected on a consistent basis in my life, I will convince other people, be careful, you're going to get rejected. It's going to happen. Because that is the deepest experience you've had in that relational area. And whatever that deepest experience is, that's what you will communicate. You might not say it very often, but again, like I talked about, there's almost like an aura or a spirit. I think your spirit's bigger than your physical body. I think it reaches out and it touches people. I think it reaches out before I ever communicate to you. You're feeling things from me. We will communicate what we're most convinced of. This becomes education. Education is what we're most convinced of, we're convincing other people of. And I am terribly concerned that because that I know at the deepest core of who I am, that's the core of education. So in the public school system, the core is what public believes, what a group of people, whether it's Department of Education or whether it's the federal government, whether it's at the state level, they're determining what is being taught. Am I right? Are there standardized tests that you teach to? Are there even below that or around that certain things you're supposed to talk about and not talk about? Like what? Give me an example of something that in the classroom you're not supposed to talk about. There's a really big one, real low-hanging fruit here. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Jesus, like that's a safe answer, but it's true. Like you cannot say that. You cannot tell people about him. You can talk about him. Can you talk about him as an historical figure? Probably not. Okay, good. But there are specific things that you're not allowed to say, and there are certain things that they want you to say. So, for example, current reality, critical race theory is now being presented as something that more and more schools are mandating being taught. Now, there are actually some good things. I've actually read critical race theory, and there are some good things in it. But at the root of it is fear. And I'm going to leave it at that. And if you want to go do some study on that, do some study on that. But the fear is that whites will remain powerful and blacks will remain victims if we don't tell this story, if we don't teach this curriculum. Go look at it. It's there. I do believe that history has not been taught accurately to our children. I really do. I think we've left things out. I think, what's that classic statement? The winners always get to tell the story. Winners always get to tell history. And it's true. And as a result, most of our education was written by white people. And so there's going to be a certain amount of education on slavery and what it was. But is there enough? Is there the basis of it? And all of that, I feel like there is a leaving of things out and there is an adding of things that isn't necessary that I believe speaks to a belief system or a faith or a core story that a few have and influence the many. I actually think education is not supposed to be in the hands of the few. I think education is supposed to be in the hands of the many. And the reason why I do is because there's so many different kinds of kids. And the more we standardize and the more that we try to create very specific ways of learning, the more only a select few actually flourish. And it's a problem in society. More than economic, more than race, I actually think there is something in the education system that sets people up for failure. And it's because we will not teach them in the way they should go. There is a way in which we should teach that actually empowers every single student to succeed. But if there's indoctrination, if there is standardization, if there's certain things that you have to hit, then I will tell you there will be this 5 to 10% at the top that will flourish and succeed, and they'll become the influencers of the next generation. And the rest of them will be the employees and work for them. And we will not shift culture to heavenly culture. Heavenly culture looks like every single child being empowered, equally and powerfully. So, here's how I think it happens. I just want to do this. So, okay, I told you Jesus is going to have to come into this, and it's going to be a miracle, but I actually think much more of the education needs to happen at the parental level and not at the school level. I'm just going to be honest with you. I think we as parents have farmed out education for far too long to teachers hired to do it. Same with the church. Like parents, it's not the children's director or Sunday school teacher's job to teach your children about Jesus. It's your job. They're going to learn from you more than anyone else on the planet. They are, like, I asked a couple people this the other night. I said, when you talk to most people, they're going to tell you, hey, where'd you learn? Like if you ask somebody a skill that they learned, or you ask somebody when they learned this or where they learned this, more often than not, they're going to say a person. I learned this from, they're not going to say from Chambersburg High School, or they're not going to say some college. They'll probably say somebody. Good or bad. Most of us here learn the most important things from our life, from someone. And that is key for me. I think systems are teaching our children, and people should be teaching our children. And systems by nature, the only way a system can teach is if it indoctrinates. It's the only way it can do it. Because we got to make everybody the same. We got to make sure everybody passes the same test. We got to make sure everybody has the same information. And not every child needs the same information. Whew. I know this sounds really different than what you're being taught to teach in your schools, and I'm sorry, but I'm telling you, this is the heavenly perspective. This child needs to learn this, and then this child needs to learn this, and then this child needs to be empowered in this so that they can flourish here. And the problem is we have overly standardized and overly simplified, and it just seems like indoctrination is the only way to do that, and I don't believe that to be the case. True education from the Christian perspective, from the Jesus perspective, from faith in Jesus, starts with encouraging personal relationship. I'm going to say something that could be hurtful to you. I'm going to say it. I think Christian education is as guilty of indoctrination as secular education. I do. I think all we're trying to do is pound the Bible down their throats, thinking that's going to heal them, fix them, or whatever. And in reality, Christian education does not exist to teach people the Bible. True Christian education constantly brings the child into the face of Jesus. Constantly. Ongoingly. In science class, the science teacher should be bringing people into the face of Jesus. I don't know how this all works practically, but I'm telling you from the heavenly perspective, teaching medicine, teaching math, teaching history brings us back to the person of Jesus. How could this history have been different if Jesus was involved? Otherwise, history repeats itself. I think Christians are just as guilty of indoctrination as any other belief system is. Because I think Christian education starts with God, Proverbs 1:7, and encourages personal relationship. Personal relationship is what leads people to pure faith in the rock who is Jesus. Education starts with God, and Hebrews 12:1 and 2 says it ends with God. He is the author and the perfecter of faith. True education is establishing Jesus as the rock of salvation in each person's life, and then allowing God and that person to build on it. That's empowerment, and that's freedom. Now, you can still teach the ABCs, and you can teach 1, 2, 3s and all of that, but if the core of that is the person of Jesus, I think something incredible called empowerment and freedom takes place. Any other faith other than the rock of Jesus will be built on. So for example, like if Jesus isn't the rock in which we start our education process, then our kids, at some point in time in their life, will have to unlearn things we've taught them. Because reestablishing faith means going back to the beginning and having to unlearn things. I remember having to unlearn things. I feel like I came to Christ in 1990. I think I was 20 or 21. 20 years old, about to turn 21. And I feel like I kind of missed out on all the indoctrination of the church, and I came into a pretty cool, real relationship with Jesus. But over those next 20 years, I still learned things that when I encountered the Father in 2011, I had to unlearn. And it took time. And I actually felt that the Lord's heart was broken a little bit, that I had learned things about his nature and character that he didn't want me to know because they weren't there. They weren't true. And so I was healed by learning who he actually was. When education is not based first and foremost on the rock of the person of Jesus, I promise you, whatever else we're building into the lives of children will eventually either, it'll shake, it'll tremble, it might even completely fall to pieces, because education must be founded on the person of Jesus. Now, I know this puts teachers like Melanie and Ashley and Maddie eventually, if you teach in the public school system, in a strange situation. Like, I still have to teach these kids every day. So, Mark, like, how am I supposed to teach? But I can't establish Jesus as the rock. Like, and so, I was thinking about this as I was preparing today. I'm like, Lord, I don't want to put these gals or guys in a hopeless situation. So how do they do this? And I thought to myself, you can still do this. Like, Proverbs 22:6, if you train up a child, if you point them in the right direction, if you love them, if you spend time getting to know who they are, if you actually learn each one of them individually. I know that's hard work. It's way easier to just pound out curriculum, or what do you call those things that you write up? Lesson plans and all that kind of stuff. And then you just follow the same lesson plan year after year over and over. Hey, I guess you could skate through teaching and finally get to your pension, but is that real education? And I would say no. But I think there's still a way to establish Jesus as the rock. And it is by asking for grace to individually connect heart to heart with each of your students. That by the end of that 180 days, each one of them almost feel like they're leaving their mom or dad to move on to the next year. And I'm willing to bet some of you have already had that experience with your students. And you feel like your child is going off to another mom or dad a little bit. When that takes place, you've gone past indoctrination, you've gone past just laying out information, and you've gone down to the rock level of who they are. And then what you do, this is the other part, and I think this is where prayer really comes in, is you ask the Lord to empower that connection by his Spirit. That connection empowers the deepest core of who they are, that Jesus is the rock of their life, so that all that teaching and all of that empowerment you've been giving them throughout the year is rooted in something solid. I know there's one teacher in my life. She's my 5th grade teacher. I know that she was one of the ones that rooted me in Jesus without ever saying his name. I know she did. Because she's a Christian today. She now can talk to me about him, and every once in a while she'll message me on Facebook and tell me how proud of me she is because of the incredible young man I still am. But I'm telling you, that girl, by how she connected with me in 5th grade, I had a crush on her too. But now I realize I had a crush on her because I saw the Lord. And I, to this day, now can connect all the dots because I now see God as he is, and I can remember seeing him in her. And there will be students that will say the same things about you all. That's the power of this. I still think we can establish the rock. I think the spirit of your room will be so different than the spirit of other rooms, where it's not about empowerment and freedom and knowing each child. It's more about just, oh my God, is it Friday yet? And don't get me wrong, I'm sure sometimes you feel that way too. But the spirit of your room is, I'm empowering children. I'm connecting at the core level of who they are. I'm learning who they are as much as they're learning who they are and what's possible in their lives. That creates a spirit and a culture of the room that calls hearts up instead of, oh God, what could happen? It's, oh God, what could happen? You hear the difference? I don't know if you can hear the difference, but I feel like there's a huge difference in these two. I think it's really important, back to this thing about establishing Jesus as the rock, and encouraging personal relationship with him. Education is offered to the child and encouraged to be submitted to Jesus in personal relationship. And again, for public school students, our teachers, I know this is difficult, but us parents, we can do this now, today. We can have our kids come home, and we can ask our kids, hey, tell them, don't, and here's something else I would suggest. Don't ask your kids what you learned today. Ask your kids, and this is going to sound SOS-y, so these that took SOS-y, sorry, but what happened inside of you today? Because what happened inside of them might have nothing to do with the information that was taught to them. But what happened inside of them is establishing their faith. And what their faith is what's going to be their story down the road. I hope you're hearing this. This is really important. Consistently ask, and if you don't have any children, ask some child you know in your life, what's going on? Like, what happened inside of you today? How did you feel today? Did someone connect with you? Did your teacher connect with you? Did you ask your, whatever it might be? If you get to that level, something deep on the inside of the child gets stirred. And hopefully it's that person of Jesus. Okay, so here I am. I'm now going to give you what I think the goal of education is from the heavenly perspective. And if you were taking any notes today, if you're a teacher, I'm actually going to probably send these out to you. But I think this is the goal of education from the heavenly perspective. And I'm not going to be able to get away from Proverbs 1:7. It starts with God. So here's the first one. A person, the goal of education, is a person who trusts their heart, and that heart has been shaped by its author. That person is Jesus. A person who trusts their heart, and it's the heart that has been shaped by its author. This is really important. Like, again, I said, even in the public education setting, I think we can still do this. A person who trusts their heart. So there's no fear in trusting your heart. Like, you cannot be in fear and trust your heart. If you have fear, you don't trust your heart, and you're always going to ask somebody else what they think. And you're always going to, oh, I don't know. I wonder what they're going to think about this. I wonder what they think. I wonder if this is right. And the more you distrust your own heart, the less you'll ever make good, healthy decisions in life. The goal of education is a person who trusts their own heart. And the best way for someone to trust their own heart is to allow it to be shaped by the one who spoke it into existence. Number 2, the goal of education from the heavenly perspective is a person who brings all information learned to the Lord. A person who brings everything that they're learning on a consistent basis to the Lord. And then they determine with him what is good. So this is what happens. I learned about Christopher Columbus today, but I didn't live back in 1492. Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue. So there's a lot of different perspectives on Christopher Columbus, Lord. If I were to ask a white person, this is what they would say. If I would ask an Indian how they felt about Christopher Columbus, what do you think they'd say? Ask an Indian if you don't know. Right. Take everything you're learning and take it before the Lord. And this is something else. I remember doing this in college because I wasn't a Christian until I went to college. I was a junior in college, and I remember taking Calculus 3. Yes, I took Calculus 3. Oh. And I remember every time I opened that book up, and I barely had a relationship with the Lord, but I knew enough to know this. If anybody can help me with this, you can. And I simply opened this book and I said, Lord, you're reading this information. You know what I'm saying? You wrote this information that I'm reading. You created this. Math is your creation. I am someone who is now connected with you by the Spirit. This is how I used to pray. Help me understand what you created. It can happen. So tell any of your kids or your students who are struggling and you're able to do this, just turn and say, God, I have no idea how to process this information. Can you help me? I have to get through this class in order to become, and then whatever it is that child wants to become. I have to figure this out. Help me. I think one of the key goals of education is realizing that everything that comes into me has to be submitted to the Lord. Take every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. Take every thought captive. Some stuff is not meant for us to have, and it needs to keep going. So, number one, a person who trusts their heart, and that heart has been shaped by Jesus. Number two, a person who brings all information learned to the Lord and allow him and that child together to determine what is good for them. Number three, goal of education is a bold, open, trusting person who wants to learn for the rest of their life. Education, the goal of education is that you make a lifelong learner out of them. A bold, open, trusting person who learns for the rest of their life. Third goal. Again, this is just based upon my prayer time with the Lord, talking about education with him. Number four, I got two more. I'm almost done. A skillful, excellent, and diligent person. A skillful, excellent, diligent person who continually strives to improve and grow. If the environment we're creating as parents or as educators encourages our children or the people in our lives to become better and constantly want to improve on already how good they are, you've succeeded in educating a child. Here's my problem with a lot of the education system the way it works right now. I take the test, and that's the last time I got to think about that information again. Hallelujah. I remember doing that. If I can just get through this final, I will never have to think about Calculus 3 again. That's the opposite of education. For many of us, education is just checking off boxes to get a degree. I got to take this many classes to get this. I got to do this to get this. I hate this, but I'm going to do it. That was never the goal of education. The goal of education was to bring a person alive, to realize what they love, what is possible, and honestly, part of education is discovering the incredible beauty that all of this world, creation, all of this is. Education was meant to open us up to all of that. Not, oh my God, I cannot wait to get out of school. So if we create a person who is skillful, excellent, and diligent, and always continually striving to improve and grow, we've succeeded as educators. And from the heavenly perspective, I think the last goal, and there's probably more, these are the ones that I was hearing and experiencing from the Lord. The last goal that I heard was a productive, generous person who teaches others to be the same. Education should always be about, I am now productive and I am generous, which means I turn and I now provide all the opportunities and all of the wealth that I was provided. You know you've succeeded as an educator when you've trained someone else up to train up other children in the way that they should go. I mean, I don't think anything brings greater joy and satisfaction to my life than to watch my own children want to empower other people. For me, that screams, hey, Mark, you did okay. You didn't screw them up. Like, your kids want to help other people, and they're generous, and they're productive. They don't just want to sit and wait for somebody else to take care of them. They look for opportunities and take advantage of all the resources that are available to them. They're skillful. They're constantly learning and growing. For me, those are all successes of education. And then if they become skillful in trades and crafts and all of that, and for me, that's icing on the cake. But that's all part of the education process. I want to reiterate one thing before we finish here today. I'm not sure how well I explained the fear versus faith thing tonight. And I'm not even sure I'm totally getting what the Lord's trying to show me yet. That's why I'm asking the Lord to continue to open me up to what he's saying there. But I think that is a key to not just education, but even the way we relate to each other, even the way we build our businesses, the way we establish and teach in churches. I think too many times we don't even realize how often we're influenced by fear instead of what is possible. There's a huge difference between those two. And I think the spirit difference between those two causes people to open up and get bigger and expand, and thereby the kingdom expands, or people feel closed in and constricted, and they're like that steward that just has the one coin and buries it. I can't wait to go to heaven. I just got to get to heaven. Instead of realizing that I can actually establish heaven here on earth, which I actually think is the real goal. So, any thoughts or questions on what I've been talking about?
This is just more of a comment, but I am taking we're reading a book club, a bunch of moms, and it's called Mama Bear Apologetics, and it's about just learning like different systems of the world and how to combat it. And the last time we met together, I just felt so discouraged because it was just a conversation of, oh my gosh, these are all the things that are wrong in the world, and how are we ever going to protect our kids from that? And so I just, I love what you said tonight. Even more than a teacher, my greatest role is a parent. And when I think about Xander and Amira, I think Ishmael and I have really been going about this the wrong way. We've been really trying to protect them from all the things, and these are all the things to watch out for, instead of empowering them and just calling out who they already are. So this has given me a lot of encouragement and a lot to think about. And I think when I go back to my book club on Monday, I am going to probably be preaching to them. We're doing this the wrong way. It can't be about fear and protection. It has to be about empowerment and trust. So, thank you.
That's awesome. And there's a little bit of wisdom. It feels really wise to protect. But I can tell you the true wisdom of God is really about what's possible, not what bad thing could happen. We've kind of misdefined wisdom as protecting people from bad stuff to happen. Wisdom is really opening us up to everything that's possible. The best protection at what's wrong is being really right. The more righteous, the more holy, the more hopeful we are, then the less that any of those things that are happening in the world can negatively impact us. And then we have more of an impact of the other on the world itself.
You're not alone, Melanie. I really felt convicted on the same topic, and Orpha and I looked at each other and said we really need to start talking to our kids a little differently and empowering them. And it really made me think that I do this routinely with my clientele, and I think that's one thing that makes me a very good counselor. I really listen to them, I get to know them really well, and where I see the healing happening for them is I feed back things that I've learned about them, either because they've told me that someone told them that at one point in their life. It's something they sometimes believe about themselves. And I realize that I think I'm guilty sometimes of this, certainly with my kids. I think I know them really well, but I get lazy in my parenting sometimes. I don't ask the questions I should be asking. So this is inspiring me, and just to probably pay attention to some things a little bit more and ask the questions a little bit more as they get older, and definitely making sure that I'm feedbacking all that information and telling them what I know of them and who they really are.
All right, thanks, guys. I'm going to send out those last ones on those last statements out on the Who family and make sure everybody gets to see those. So, love you all. Thank you so much for being here.